Somewhere in Rhode Island, there's a farmhouse, 14 rooms, a wraparound porch, a well out back that nobody uses anymore. If you drove past it today, you'd think it was just an old New England house, the kind real estate listings call full of character. But if you stopped the car, if you walked up that gravel driveway, if you stood on that porch and knocked, somebody would probably answer. And they'd probably tell you, yes, this is that house. The one from the movie. Except the movie wasn't supposed to be the scary part. The movie was the cleaned up version. This is the real story. Every name is real. Every date is real. And where the story splits into what the family says happened versus what actually happened, I'm going to tell you both. Because that's the only honest way to tell it. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Before it was the Conjuring house. Before Hollywood, before any of it. It was just the Arnold estate. Built in 1736, sitting on 8.5 acres outside the small town of Harrisville, Rhode Island, near the Massachusetts border. Old houses accumulate old tragedies, and this one had plenty on record. Not folklore, but actual entries in the town's historical record, sometimes called the Black Book of Burrillville. Over roughly 2 centuries, the property had seen 2 suicides by hanging, 1 suicide by poison, 2 drownings, and 4 men who froze to death nearby. There was also a documented horror, the rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl, Prudence Arnold, by a hired farmhand. None of that proves a haunting. Old properties in New England often have body counts like this if you dig into deed records and town histories long enough, but it's the soil the legend grew out of. And it's real. One name that would later become central to the legend also really existed. Bathsheba Sherman, a 19th century local woman. Here's the important part, and it matters for what comes later. Bathsheba never actually lived in this farmhouse. She lived on a different property, the Sherman farm, some distance away. By most historical accounts, she was an ordinary, hard-working woman. There's no reliable historical record that she was a murderer, a witch, or a Satanist. That reputation was something that formed later, and, as we'll get to, appears to have been substantially built by the very people investigating this case. Keep that in your pocket. It's going to matter a lot by the end of this story. On January 1971, Carolyn and Roger Perrin move into the farmhouse with their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April. Roger worked away from home often for his job. Carolyn was left managing the house and 5 kids largely alone. It's worth sitting with that detail because isolation and exhaustion are part of almost every haunting story ever told, not as a debunking but as context. According to the family's own accounts, mainly documented decades later by the eldest daughter, Andrea Perron, in a memoir series called House of Darkness, House of Light. The strange things started almost immediately. Small things first. A broom that seemed to move on its own. Unexplained piles of dirt appearing on floors that had just been cleaned. Cold spots. Odd smells. Then it escalated, according to the family. Apparitions. A recurring figure, a woman, described with a broken neck, appearing at night. Furniture moving. And the person the family says was targeted most was Carolyn herself, waking up with unexplained marks and bruises on her body, describing something like being stabbed by an unseen force. The daughters, interviewed decades later, described their own individual encounters, strange voices, presences in bedrooms, a general sense that something in the house did not want them there. For roughly 3 years, the Perrons say they dealt with this largely alone. By 1973, Carolyn reportedly reached out for help, and that's when Ed and Lorraine Warren enter the story. The Warrens weren't strangers to the public even then. Ed Warren was a World War II veteran and former police officer who became a self-taught demonologist. Lorraine claimed to be a clairvoyant and light trance medium, able to sense and communicate with what Ed identified. Together, back in 1952, they'd founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, one of the oldest paranormal investigation groups in the country. By the time they reached the Perron farmhouse, they'd already built a reputation from cases like a supposedly demonically afflicted doll named Annabelle, a case that would, decades later, spin off into its own film franchise. The Warrens made multiple trips to the farmhouse. According to their own case notes and the Perron family's accounts, a member of their investigative team reported seeing a misty, human-shaped figure. There were unexplained noises, and Lorraine, using her claimed psychic sense, determined the entity responsible for the family's suffering was the spirit of Bathsheba Sherman. This is the moment where the legend of Bathsheba as a murderous, demonic witch really gets constructed. Carolyn Perrin reportedly did her own amateur historical digging, talking to locals, then having those stories confirmed through psychic means rather than documentation. That's how a woman with no real historical record of wrongdoing became, in the family's and Warren's retelling, a child-killing occultist. The Warrens' investigation built toward a seance in 1973, intended to identify and remove whatever was tormenting the house. According to Andrea Perron's later account, things went further than anyone planned. During the seance, Carolyn was reportedly thrown violently from her chair. Some versions of the story, including material later dramatized in film, describe something closer to a possession. Carolyn allegedly speaking in a voice and language not her own, describing horrifying visions, at one point reportedly being lifted off the ground. Frightened by how far things had gone, Roger Perron asked the Warrens to leave the house. And here's the detail that should stop you for a second. Despite everything the family says happened, including a seance they describe as nearly getting someone killed, the Perrons stayed in that farmhouse for 7 more years. They didn't move out until 1980, a full decade after moving in. This is where the story gets more complicated than the movie poster. Ed and Lorraine Warren spent their careers being described in the media as the foremost paranormal investigators in America. They claimed, cumulatively, to have investigated over 10,000 cases, including the Amityville house, the Enfield poltergeist in England, and the Snedeker family haunting, all of which, notably, would go on to become their own major horror films. But their legacy is genuinely contested, and not just by random skeptics online. In 2016, researcher Joe Nickell, writing for the Skeptical Inquirer, a well-established publication focused on scientific scrutiny of paranormal claims, published a detailed analysis of the Perron case. His conclusion was that the reported phenomena were consistent with mundane explanations. Strong winds moving through an old, drafty 18th century house. Simple misperception, a child's imaginary friend. The psychological effects of suggestion and role-play within a family already primed to expect something frightening, and the well-documented unreliability of specific memory after 30 or 40 years had passed before the detailed accounts were written down. Journalists and researchers who've dug into the Warrens' broader career have raised harder questions still, describing them, in less generous retellings, less as investigators and more as showmen who built a profitable touring and media career out of frightened families, sometimes escalating claims well beyond what any physical evidence supported. There's a human cost buried in this, too. Bathsheba Sherman, a real historical woman with, by most accounts, an unremarkable life, had her reputation permanently rewritten into that of a murderous witch, largely off the back of the Perron-Warren narrative. Her actual grave has reportedly been vandalized over the years by people who believed the fictionalized version of her story was history. None of this definitively proves nothing happened in that house. It's genuinely unresolvable. No camera captured anything conclusive in the 1970s, and everyone with a first-hand account has an obvious incentive, financial or emotional, to tell it one way. That unresolved tension is arguably the scariest part of the whole story. Not knowing, 40 years later, whether an entire family and a pair of professional demonologists experienced something genuinely inexplicable, or whether wind, grief, isolation, and suggestion built something out of nothing, and it got frozen into legend before anyone could check. The Perrons left in 1980. Nothing more was publicly heard about the house for decades outside of paranormal enthusiast circles. Ed Warren died in 2006, before any of what came next. Then, in 2013, director James Wan released The Conjuring, a horror film based on the Perron family's case, with Lorraine Warren, still alive at that point, serving as a consultant. She would later say the filmmakers didn't take much more dramatic license than she felt was necessary, though the film compresses the timeline, invents a full-blown demonic possession and exorcism sequence, and turns Bathsheba into a far more overt, cinematic villain than any historical or even original case file account supports. The film was a massive hit, and it did something the original case never did on its own. It turned Ed and Lorraine Warren into modern folk heroes, and it turned an ordinary Rhode Island farmhouse into one of the most famous haunted houses in the world. What followed was one of the most successful horror franchises in film history. 9 mainline and spin-off films across roughly a decade, including 2 direct Conjuring sequels, 3 Annabelle films, 2 Nun films, and The Curse of La Llorona, each one loosely built from other cases the Warrens claimed to have investigated, like the Enfield poltergeist in London and the Smurl family haunting in Pennsylvania. Lorraine Warren continued working as a paranormal investigator and served as a consultant on the films until her death in 2019, living just long enough to see her and her late husband become bona fide cinematic icons, however contested the underlying history remained. In 2019, a family named Corey and Jennifer Heinzen, people with a personal interest in the paranormal, bought the actual farmhouse for under $440,000. They renovated it and made a deliberate choice. They marketed it openly as the Conjuring House, opening its doors to paying visitors, overnight paranormal investigators, and film crews. That's the situation today. It's a functioning tourist and paranormal investigation destination. Ghost hunting shows have filmed segments there. A caretaker connected to the property has built a following of over 1 million people on social media posting videos from inside it. Skeptical researchers, including Joe Nickel himself, have taken guided tours and continued to push back on specific claims, like the persistent legend that 7 dead soldiers are buried inside walls that are, by simple measurement, only about 4 inches thick. Physically impossible. Andrea Perron, now an adult with children of her own, still returns to the house periodically and has continued to defend both the family's original account and, notably, Bathsheba Sherman's real historical reputation, arguing the film went too far in demonizing a woman she believes was unfairly blamed. As of today, the story has one more recent chapter. In September 2025, Warner Brothers released The Conjuring: Last Rites, the 9th film in the franchise and billed as Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson's final outing as Ed and Lorraine Warren, built around the Warrens' real-life investigation of the Smurl family haunting. It became the highest-grossing film in the franchise's history, pulling in roughly $499 million worldwide, even as critics gave it distinctly mixed reviews, many pointing out the uncomfortable irony of a story about 2 now seriously scrutinized figures being packaged, once again, as uncomplicated heroes. Because the film made so much money, Warner Brothers is not actually done. A prequel, currently titled The Conjuring: First Communion, is in development, set in 1964 and centered on a younger Ed and Lorraine investigating a haunted antique mirror, with a release date currently set for September 2027. So the honest ending to this story, as of today, is this. The house still stands in Harrisville, Rhode Island, still open for anyone brave enough to book a stay. The woman blamed for it all has been dead for over 150 years and, depending who you ask, was never guilty of anything at all. The family who lived through it are still alive, still telling their version, and the franchise built on top of all of it isn't finished. It's just getting its next installment ready. Whatever actually happened in that farmhouse in the 1970s, wind through old timbers or something that still hasn't left, the story never really stopped. It just started making money. Everything above reflects what's publicly documented: the Perron family's own published accounts, the Warrens' case history, contemporary news coverage, and skeptical analysis by researchers who've directly examined the claims. Where the paranormal claims and the skeptical explanations conflict, both are presented, because that unresolved gap is the actual honest state of the story, not a plot hole to be filled in.